Hello, welcome to the College of Public Services Brown Bag Research Series. Today, we're going to have graduate social work students presenting their social movement analysis projects. I am Dr. Cynthia George, and I get to teach these wonderful students in the fall, and then we work in the spring to get their papers publishable and to publish their zines in a journal. Today, we're going to be talking with Marian Evans, who did her work on bullying prevention, and she's got both a zine and a paper that's going to be published. And then Kristen did her work on the Preventing Child Abuse movement and the early history of that, which is these are both such important histories, especially for social workers, to understand the history of how humans began to prevent child abuse and how humans have prevented bullying, right? And those are two very important things for us to consider. And so what is a social movement? For this course, we use Blumer's four-stage model for analyzing a social movement, which social movements are typically loosely organized groups that are seeking to change things about society in some way, form, or fashion. They generally are seeking to change both policy, organizational and public policy, as well as culture, right? They're trying to change across the board, right, to create a culture change. But the stages are emergence, coalescence, bureaucratization, and decline, which does not necessarily mean failure. But emergence is when a social movement first starts. It is often a trauma or some sort of tragedy where people are having an emotional reaction to something. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement emerged right after Trayvon Martin was shot, and that social sort of response to that. Coalescence is where the popularity of the movement rises and people begin to coalesce or come around those original emerging leaders, right? As those Black Lives Matter protests started to spread across the country and even across the world, right? So every coalescing around, and then leaders emerge. And then there's bureaucratization, right? And that is where those leaders begin to formalize the social movement to some degree. This is a critical stage. Sometimes a social movement will fall in on itself as it tries to formalize. Like the Occupy Wall Street movement kind of collapsed in on itself as it tried to create this strategic plan. Black Lives Matter did a pretty good job. They had an organization and a lot of plans and a structure, and they actually accomplished a whole lot of things. And then there's decline, right? And sometimes the social movement will decline because it accomplishes its goals, right? There's success, and so you don't really need to proceed anymore. For example, the March of Dimes, right? And so they had accomplished a lot of things, and so, or they can change their mission, right? And so they changed to like a reading initiative. And so social movements will, when they reach a level of success, they will generally either stop or they'll change or adapt or evolve their mission. And then they could be repressed by the government. Black Lives Matter certainly faced a lot of repression with laws trying to prevent them from protesting in the streets and that sort of stuff, blocking traffic. Co-optation. Some people would say that Louis Farrakhan came in and co-opted the Black Lives Matter movement and created a sort of factions within the movement. And he's very anti-LGBTQ, where many other parts of the movement are pro-LGBTQ. And so that created some levels of failure or factions within the movement, right? And so, and then sometimes the movement will just get established with the mainstream, which ultimately is where the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, is going, despite all of its movement through these stages, right? And so that's really what the class is about, and that's just kind of an overview of what the model is. Students also think about the types of social movements and how much change they're trying to achieve. And the two we're going to be talking about today are the Preventing Child Abuse and Stopping Bullying, which are both really radical social movements in trying to stop these things from occurring. And then we publish all of these each year in the Creating Change Journal. This is an open access journal that, thank you to Dr. Glenda Alvin, who came to this session last year and said, "Oh, Dr. George, these should be in a journal." And so thanks to her, we now have the Online Journal of Zines about social movements. And that is published the spring of each year. And I'm going to actually share the screen for that. So, whoops, let me get the right screen up to share for that. I apologize. I have a private email screen up. Let me get this one. Why is this not working? And so you can see here, you'll use this and you can go back through the different volumes. Volume 5 is this year. It will be published probably in about 2 weeks once I collect the last versions of the papers. But you can look at last year. This was Maggie Canby. And each student gets their own title page, right? Their own citation for their work, and then their one-page zine. And a mini zine is meant to be printed and then folded, and they turn into a little booklet, right? And so the little booklet opens up, right? And so that's what a mini zine is, and it's a way to add some artistic expression to social movements. And zines have always been used, well, since the photocopier was invented, but zines or pamphlets, even before handwritten pamphlets, have been used by social movements as a means of an independent press to get ideas out that the mainstream press may not be picking up. And so make sure that you check out the Creating Change Journal. And I'm gonna ask for a brief comment from James Kerr, who is our student editor this year. I'm very happy to say we're adding papers to the journal this year. And so Marian Evans is going to publish her paper and Kristen Jenkins is going to publish her paper. And then James Kerr has been serving as our student editor. James, would you like to make a few comments?
Sure. Hey, everybody. It's good to see you. And I'm just honored to have been a part of this process. I've been humbled and inspired by the work that I've seen. And I don't know, it's just a beautiful addition year after year to see the zines grow, and the addition of papers is really exciting. So I just glad to be here, and thank you for giving me the opportunity, and thank you for letting me read your material and all that. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, James. And Kristen, are you about ready? While you're pulling up, like,
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, I'm going to embarrass James and show him. He did this project back when I taught. He's in issue 1, volume 1. His zine is here, and he hated it. And he thought it was so silly, and I loved it. And because it's so creative, right? And it's just simple, right? But you print that out and fold it, and just the artwork I thought was really cool, and it was very indicative and representative of the prison abolition movement. And so his zine is published. Little brag moment. All right, Kristen, are you ready to give us your presentation on the bullying prevention movement? Or I'm sorry, the Stop Child Abuse?
Yes, I am. I tried to get my camera to work, but I can't get it to work. So I'm sorry about that.
Well, I promise you all, she has a beautiful face, but we will just settle for your slides. Are you able to share those?
Yes.
Excellent. I'm going to go on mute and take about 5 to 10 minutes and talk about your movement.
Alrighty. Can you all see my screen? And so, again, I'm Kristen Jenkins, and so my movement is on prevent child abuse and neglect. And one moment, I'm sorry.
Try the down arrow key, maybe.
And so the introduction, So at a minimum, child abuse and neglect is defined as any act or failure to act on the part of a parent or caretaker, which results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse, or exploitation. The first documented case of child abuse in the United States was Mary Ellen McCormick, also known as Mary Ellen Wilson. Due to the death of her father as a Union soldier and her mother not being able to financially support her, her mother was forced to send her to the city's orphanage, Blackwell's Island, where she was later adopted by a Manhattan couple. The adoptive mother, Miss Colony, took to physically abusing Mary Ellen. And sometime in late 1873, the abuse gained the attention of her. They complained to the Department of Charities and Correction, and the assigned investigator was Etta Angel Wheeler, and she was frustrated by the lack of child protection laws. So Wheeler approached the American Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which is ASPCA in New York. From there, the founder of ASPCA, Henry Berg, recruited a prominent lawyer, Ulrich Jerry, who took the case to New York Supreme Court. And within 48 hours of Wheeler's initial report, an investigation was conducted, a petition was filed, a protective removal was effected, a hearing was commenced, a temporary placement was arranged, and a criminal prosecution was initiated. This led to Ms. Colony being charged and found guilty of several counts of assault and battery, and the court ruled for the child to be removed from the home. Colony was sentenced to a year in jail, and it was deemed that it is society's responsibility for protection of children. So stage one. So stage one is the social ferment stage, and it is important to note that the first anti-cruelty laws were enacted on behalf of animals and not children. And I want to say that again for the importance. And so anti-cruelty laws were enacted on behalf of animals and not children. And the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children was incorporated and was recognized as the first child protection agency in the world. It wasn't until pediatrician C. Henry Kemp detailed and examined child battering in 1962, thus concluding that child abuse should be recognized as a regular and reoccurring aspect of family life, not a sensational exception, but a common syndrome. Stage two, the coalition. This is where leaders merge. And so for most abused and neglected children, help came. If it came from family and neighbors willing to get involved. And then police and courts followed. So Berg, Jerry, and Wheeler all demanded not only protection for Mary, but to put laws and policies in place to protect all children from abuse and neglect. Stage three is bureaucratization, which is the formalization of higher levels of organization and coalition-based strategies. So Henry Berg and attorney Eldridge Jerry laminated the fact that no government agency or non-governmental organization was responsible for child protection in the United States. And so thus the news about the NYSPPC spread, as well as the Henry Kemp of where he did the battered syndrome, and that led to organizations being formed. And so some of the organizations are Prevent Child Abuse America, which was founded in 1972, which advocates policies and services that strengthens families and communities, promote healthy development, and prevent child abuse before it happens. Then we have the Children Bureau, which provided federal money from 1921 to 1929 for health services for mothers and babies. And then we have the Tennessee Department of Children's Services, which is local and state, and it promotes safety, permanency, and well-being. In stage four, the decline. Since there is a child protection agency in each state in the United States, there has been a decline despite civil and criminal statutes that are that citizens are subject to. And so there are civil statutes that where you can't have to go to civil court, and then criminal statutes of where you may be arrested or be prosecuted in criminal court. And so many states also recognize 4 major types of maltreatment in their definitions, which is neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. And so in conclusion, social workers are fighting to prevent child abuse and neglect daily. Social workers are being systematically oppressed because they are expected to carry out their jobs without the resources to give the children the best possible option. Instead, social workers protect children with the bare minimum and the lack of support while they are expected to do their jobs. The bigger picture is looking to conclude whether bureaucracy supports the missions and values of child protection agencies, because it appears they are working against the movement in order to repress the people of color and defund the cause. And the first step is to revisit laws, policies, and procedures so that they align with NASW in hopes in combating this movement.
Thank you. Marian, and we'll do both student presentations and then we'll open the floor for discussion. And so Marian is going to talk about, we're going to skip forward into history to bullying prevention, which is also endangers children.
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, so this is social movement analysis, anti-bullying. So this is the anti-bullying social movement, and it's on the basis that students are unable to stop bullying on their own. Bully victims are viewed as completely powerless to change their situation without outside intervention. And so the anti-bullying movement represents empowerment, which is consistent with the NASW values of social justice, dignity, and worth of a person, importance of human relationships, and integrity. So some of the actions include mistreatment, coercion, intimidation, humiliation, and harassment. The targeting acts of bullying tend to be repetitive towards the victim. And the types to be considered are physical, verbal, social, and cyber, which you can imagine cyber is like the most trendiest because technology has evolved. I remember being in high school and when Facebook come out, and now like there's Instagram and TikTok. So you can just imagine how bullying has just like evolved. So the imbalance of power that associates with the ability to control or harm. Bullying factors include popularity status, physical strength, or access to embarrassing information of the victim, like blackmail. So the emergence is in 1897, the first significant bullying journal article was written by Frederick Burke. It was called Teasing and Bullying. Then there was a long gap before bullying issues were addressed again. In 1983, 3 adolescent boys died by suicide due to severe bullying of peers in Norway, and which caused like a national campaign against bullying in schools. And then Norway's Ministry of Education commissioned Dan Orius to conduct an extensive research and intervention project on bully victim problems. So in 1999, the Columbine High School massacre occurred in the United States. That's when 2 adolescent boys went into a school with guns and bombs, and it resulted in the murders of 12 students, 1 teacher, and then the 2 shooters committed suicide. The coalescence. Dr. Dan Orius gradually evolved the concept of bullying prevention with over 40 years of involvement in research and intervention work among school children and youth. And then in 1970, he pursued a large-scale project, which is now regarded as the first scientific study of bullying problems in the world. Dr. Dan has gained both national and international recognition for momentum of a social movement through research. So he is a pioneer. Bureaucratization. In the 1980s, Dr. Dan Oyes first conducted the Oyes Bullying Prevention Program implementation and evaluation within the United States. He conducted the first systematic intervention as a longitudinal study in which he documented the positive effects of his bullying prevention program. The goals of the program were to reduce existing bullying problems among students, prevent the development of new bullying problems, and achieve better peer relationships at school. The target was usually elementary, middle, and junior high levels, and the program was proven to be effective. The decline. So as Dr. George was saying, it wasn't necessarily a decline, but it was kind of like people kind of stopped pushing it as much. The Dr. Oyes Bullying Prevention Program and research has proven success at the most dominant model. Resurgence and widespread of bullying poses questions. Does the program suit all school characteristics for bullying resolution? Does the program fit the structure for schools today? And the Dr. Oyes Bullying Prevention Program is not the permanent solution to bullying. In conclusion, the physical, mental, and emotional distress effects of bullying include anxiety, depression, loneliness, stress, and others, to name a few, are listed. A recommendation would be educate students on emotional intelligence and emotion regulation. So emotional intelligence is defined as the ability to understand and manage emotions, as well as recognize and influence the emotions of those around you. And then emotion regulation is used to describe a person's ability to effectively manage and respond to an emotional experience. So how can social workers progress the anti-bullying movement? By advocating, encouraging reporting of bullying incidents, spreading awareness, and providing accessible resources to support anti-bullying efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent work. And I would like to open the floor to questions for Kristen, Marian, James as a student editor, or myself. Questions or comments? You can stop your screen share.
Yeah.
There we go.
Thank you.
Well, I can start. I just want to say thank you to both of you students for excellent presentations and sharing your work with us. My name's Meg Streams. I'm in the Public Administration Department. I thought one of the really interesting things was in both talk, well, in the first talk, making the point that abuse of animals there was organization around abuse of animals in the United States before there was organization of abuse of children. And I don't know if maybe that had to do with the tendency to view children as the possessions of the family and specifically of the father. But something that I thought connected with the bullying prevention talk, and I was wondering about it, is it sounds like the movement to prevent bullying started surrounding children, but in more recent years, we've heard about bullying in the workplace and how even among adults there can be bullying. And I wondered is that a social movement that emerged from what you studied about the movement with children? So that the children focus came first?
Yeah, so like Dr. Frederick Burke, like even the teasing, like the title of his journal, we don't even hear about the word teasing anymore, which when you think about teasing, it derives from children. And so bullying definitely is centered around students in that setting. But like you said, now we know that bullying can happen in like the workplace with adults, but it probably wasn't a term that you would associate with adults all the time. So I think that's why they associate it with children so much.
I will also add that I don't think there has been a large scale social movement to prevent bullying of adults. But I think that it would be helpful because where are the children learning it from? Right. And so I do think it would be helpful, and let's start a social movement.
I agree, it's not at all as widespread, but there was some movement towards trying to formulate HR policies that would be against bullying and recognizing that that kind of behavior can also take place. And this idea, I'm so glad you brought up, Marian, about teasing, because it reminds me of the way bullying occurs in social media. And people say, well, I was just joking, you know, they make threats all the time and say really horrible things that cause fear and panic in people. And then they say, well, I was just joking. You can't take a joke. I was just trolling, right? But to the person that's receiving that, it doesn't feel that way. So both very great presentations.
I have a question for Marian. In regards to the Columbine massacre, were those 2 students bullied?
So the way that it was worded is that it was like a revenge type of situation. So, but at the end they did commit suicide. So it wasn't really like that their family and friends were able to speak on their behalf on that. But the way that it was worded in the news report, it was like kind of like a retaliation situation.
Okay, thank you.
Questions or comments for our speakers? Public policy. Okay, there's a question in the chat about, do we need more public policy to prevent these problems? And anybody want to speak about public policy, Kristen or Marian, around bullying prevention or child abuse prevention? What's happening right now?
I would say yes. We probably do need more public policies to prevent child abuse and neglect, just because with the decline, with the establishment of the mainstream, I think that a lot of people are under the impression that, oh, there's DCS or there are all these child protection agencies that are in place. So us as society, you know, they can take care of that. And I think that's kind of how it's looked at. But in Tennessee, there is a lot of things going on with DCS. I've actually worked for DCS before, and actually partnered with them, and it's just a lot of policy change that probably could encourage and could advocate better for children. And so, yeah, I do think that we need more public policies to get things written in black and white to improve this.
And just to see that, I would just say like bullying needs more of a definition for people to actually put a policy into place, because everybody has a different interpretation.
Now, we'll also add that in Tennessee, bullying prevention is funded through the BEP, or the Basic Education Program, which is part of the budget that allocates funding to schools across the state. And currently, the code is that schools should have a committee to address bullying prevention. And we would very much like to see that schools shall have instead of should have, to make that. But the problem is it's unfunded. And so there's no money allocated for bullying prevention in the BEP. And so the schools should do something ends up not being addressed, in many cases for lack of resources. Lack of resources is also impacting what Kristen was talking about with the Department of Children's Services, and they're seeking policies around maximum caseloads, and also around accountability, because when you've got that many cases, that's not humanly possible to see them all. There's also a trend of privatization, where private, not-for-profit or for-profit providers are coming in working state contracts, and rather than the Department of Children's Service being all government employees. And in that switch from one system to the other, people fall through the cracks. And I think a lot of that is what is going on right now.
I have a question from being a concerned father. Are there any programs in school that are designed to help parents understand if their child might be bullying or bullying other students?
Did you run across any of that in your research, Marian?
As far as programs, I didn't see any specific programs targeted for bullying. They have things like, the suicide hotline, but that's why in my presentation, I put there needs to be like more awareness and like something specific for bullying, not just like something that's gonna like, touch the surface. I didn't see anything personally when I was doing research about programs for bullying specifically.
And I will add to that just a little. If you do a literature search of peer-reviewed literature for best practices for bullying prevention, you will in that list of things find communication with parents. And there's various strategies for doing that, especially around cyberbullying. There have been some new tools developed in terms of recognizing when your child may be exhibiting distress on social media, right? And what emojis mean and that sort of stuff. So there's been some new trainings around that. You can Google some of that too, just as a parent, because whether or not you get it is dependent upon your school district and whether or not they have funding and the will to support this. Because remember, the law should have a comprehensive system to address bullying, but there's no money for it, and there's really not a lot of guidance for it. It's one of the things that the National Association of Social Workers would like to see a school social worker in every single school across the state. Right now, we have one in every local education agency, but that could mean they're trying to cover 10 or 20 schools, right? And so we want to improve the caseload for school social workers. And we believe that school social workers should be in charge of that comprehensive plan for bullying prevention. And it should include interventions to the bully, interventions to the potential bully victims, interventions to the universal audience that promote norms against bullying, right? And then also interventions to parents, interventions potentially even with law enforcement when they have to there has to be a response when bullying gets really severe. Right. And so all of that should be part of a comprehensive plan. To my knowledge, I don't know of a single location in Tennessee that has a really good bullying prevention plan that I could hold up as a model. There may be one, but the state is currently not highlighting that or focusing on it.
Yeah. That's a good discussion, because just as a father observing my children who are in the 4th and 3rd grade, and things that they have just articulated to me coming home, things that happen in the classroom and things, nothing too egregious, but it sparked some thoughts in my mind that like, I wonder who's monitoring that. Some things, minor things that happen. And it's a really good public school that they're in. Dr. Chilton's son went through that school as well. And I've just, as a concerned father, this is the first time I've had children in the 4th and 3rd grade. And so seeing some of the things they're talking about, and I'm like, I'm wondering how they're communicating this to parents. And Ken, you and I have had discussions about that as well.
Well, that's what I was going to, so speaking of social movements, from what little I know, one of the remedies that people talk about, and when it comes, not a remedy, but to address bullying is social emotional learning, which then prompts a new social movement that's totally against SEM. It's kind of the tribalism. Anything that's a solution or a potential solution is going to be resisted. The motto of the school district has been attacked. It's be nice. And there are people who are against using that because it's a form of social emotional learning, which is mind-boggling to me, but that's where we're at. So this competing movements, it's vexing.
It is. And I think that really this also butts up against the movements to suppress diversity and equity and inclusion, because that really in many ways is what bullying is about people in positions of power, whether it be status or, money or whatever, that are bullying and picking on people that aren't in those positions of power. And it's often students with disabilities, it's students with weight issues, it's students with a different color of skin or that come from a different cultural background than the norm in those communities. And so in regards to your children, I think it's important for you to recognize that no one is probably monitoring it. The school very likely does not have a comprehensive way to address bullying. You can ask them if they do, right? But they probably don't. And you have to be careful that your child does not get caught up being a bully or a bully victim, right? And so you have to teach your child there's a concept of a bystander, right? Or being a good bystander. And when you're a bystander and you see something going on, then you are able to don't do anything to put yourself at risk, right? If somebody's being violent or aggressive, but it's about knowing where to go to get help, to report that someone vulnerable is being hurt. And doing that in a way where you're not like being a tattletale is someone that is telling of someone authority when the person actually had it handled, right? That's tattletelling. Or, being a snitch is someone that was involved in the crime and then later decided to tell, right? And then just going for help is what we need to have to separate, right? Just going for help when someone vulnerable is being hurt is not something that children should be ashamed of. And I think that the concept of snitching or tattletelling has confused a lot of kids where they will be silent on that sort of stuff. And as parents and teachers, we have to make sure that they can separate the difference to articulate what's happening to them. Because I think a lot of people, adults included, it's hard to recognize when you're being bullied, right? Because our natural tendency is to sort of shut down or cope with it, or to find some way to dismiss that that's not happening to you. But really the way we treat each other as human beings is on trial right now in society, and especially in Tennessee.
And I think to follow up on that, the research about it suggests, I believe, that observing bullying happening can itself creates negative emotions and hurts the other people. So not only is the individual who's being bullied, whether they're a child or an adult, is experiencing this horrible thing, but the other children or adults who not in positions of power have to observe it and know it's happening and feel powerless to do something about it. They're going through some bad things as well. So it has a contaminating effect on the overall culture of whatever the place is where it's happening. But I think what makes it really challenging for the schools now, even more than it used to be, which is a perennial, even before the movement existed, right? This was happening. It's humans. Humans have always done this, I think. But now schools, bullying cannot stop. Some of the cases I've read about, because of social media, the child can't even escape when they go home and they're in their family and their protected environment where they have a healthy family environment, hopefully, they're still not safe. So they don't even get a break, because every second some kid's on Snapchat or something doing it, and they feel compelled to not miss out on those settings, So it's not an easy organizational thing to deal with when it can happen invisibly, not just physically in the schoolyard.
We've got another couple of questions from the chat, but I'll just say you can look some of that stuff up, Dr. Streams, you were talking about, is called tertiary trauma, where you were traumatized by things you witness other people, and it functions through your mirror neurons, where your brain really is processing that those things could or might have happened to you. And it does lead to, see, Emory has added about COVID, right? The explosion of social anxiety with kids and adults, and just the fact that we have all gone through a collective trauma. And you know, and things have just changed, right? Things have changed because of COVID. And there is a lot more anxiety and depression and lack of support. And the bullying has kind of transferred to this cyber setting, where schools can just kind of feel like, oh, that didn't happen at school. That happened online at their home. That's between y'all, right? And again, they're not being funded to invest in bullying prevention. And so that becomes easy to do. We've got another question here from what about how much training social workers get to advocate for political change around these issues? Marian or Kristen, how well have I trained y'all to deal with this stuff?
I would say a lot of it is going to have to be firsthand experience. Just communication with people in general is tricky. You don't know how they're going to interpret it. You can say I'm teasing. You can say you're joking. It's about the intent. So I say I'm very glad that field placement is a part of our requirements to become, you know, because you have to have like interaction with people. Like in my presentation, I talked about emotional intelligence because a lot of people don't think it's important, but it really is.
Yes, and I think that there's a movement towards restorative practices as well. And I personally would love to see a whole course developed on restorative practices in education. The School of Social Work or Social Work program are talking about developing better school social work programs, and restorative practices would be part of that, because really the bullies are also hurt, right? Rarely ever are these bullies, I mean, they're not well-functioning, emotionally mature individuals, or they would not be bullying someone else. And so, and it's really hard to find compassion for the bully. And so sometimes they get left out of treatment for that, but the solution does involve addressing the problem through those kids that are hurt too, right? And sometimes it's domestic violence, you know, who knows what it is, but all of those cases, they're very complex, and you really have to be able to have the resources locally to dig into and figure out what is triggering this child to act in this bullying way. And that takes time and resources that school social workers will do that all day long, but we've got to employ them and put them in the schools and authorize them to do those activities. All right, it's 12:43. We got some more time. Anybody else have any questions or comments?
Well, to that last point about restorative justice, I don't know much about it, but we're talking about social movements, and is that another very strong social movement that's been underway since, I don't know when it started, probably since the New Deal.
Navajo.
But yeah, could you even develop and teach a class in restorative justice, or is that one of those types of programs that people who fund programs are inherently knee-jerk against?
I think that it could be done, and it is being done in a lot of places. Restorative practices, the idea originally comes from indigenous cultures, the Navajo, and it is how indigenous cultures dealt with issues within their tribes, right? And so they recognize like if anyone is harmed, everyone is harmed, right? And so that's just the collective mentality of their culture. And so they care about the person doing the harm in the same way that they care about the person being harmed. And so that's the kind of basic tenets of restorative justice, and where you look at the harm that was done and you are able to assess and process that. And sometimes it's appropriate to get the victim and the bully together. Sometimes it's not appropriate. There's a lot of expertise that has been developed around restorative practices as the Western world has taken it from the Navajo. All right. And so that really started occurring in the late 80s, early 90s. And now you will actually see all the way to in the 2020s, we have school systems that say they utilize restorative practices. Like Metro Nashville Public Schools says they use restorative practices, where instead of putting kids in school suspension or punishing them, they will instead send them to a behavior coach where they're getting positive reinforcement, or they're going through drills to put them in an emotionally evocative situation and try to get them to react better, right? So they're getting structured response on the ways that they react. And so they'll try to meet that with love rather than discipline. But you do in Tennessee have this other part of our culture that wants to spank kids, that wants to incite bullying, that wants to suppress any inclusion of diversity, that wants the kids to go, that sends their kids to school with the pressure to sort of fight or be tough, I mean, and so that is something that is hard to do, because how do you help that kid that has been told by their parents to be tough when you can't actually intervene with the parents, right? Because the school can't make the parents not promote that culture. And so it's hard, because sometimes you will end up pitting the child against their own family in that dilemma. And so it's not an easy solution. But that's kind of where restorative practices are. It's been well established. There's an International Institute for Restorative Practices. You can get training certificates and degrees in restorative practices. There are a good amount of books published about it. It is beginning to also be integrated into healthcare settings, and using restorative practices in higher education is a relatively new phenomenon. Either I can't find anything really about it, but boy, I think we could use it right at TSU. And so honestly, I think that just like the world is ripe for an anti-academic bullying social movement, the world is also ripe for a restorative justice in academia movement as well. There's another question here. Is restorative action still occurring with all the new legislation coming up? Yes, and of course that the biggest barrier to that is the legislation and the Republican supermajority that is really moving the state in the opposite direction. And they, of course, are having their own sort of in-group bullying. I don't know if y'all saw the audio leaked, right? And so, I mean, honestly, I'm not even going to say that Republicans are bullies. I'm going to say that there's a certain contingent of people that are bullies operating within the Republican Party that I think are bullying the whole state and using that party, because that's what bullies do when they grow up unchecked, is they become bigger bullies and with more power. And they have been convinced by it being ignored their whole lives that they're justified or that they're right in that response. And so just the whole approach of forcing other people to do what you think is best is on trial right now, like as the human race. Like, where are the limits between what can we ask other people to do or not to do around us, whether it's wearing a mask, is the government bullying us by doing that, right? Or, can all of the things are on trial from both sides. And it's a scary place to be right now. But, and that's why it's important. I'll start wrapping us up here, but that's also why it's important to remember the early history. Okay, because all of these movements, they are in this long life cycle of change. Like Black Lives Matter, it's not just now that the police brutality was a thing, right? I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement is ultimately a resurgence of the Black Panther Party or these other sort of movements that have come throughout history. In the same way that this bullying prevention, whatever is about to emerge for bullying prevention right now, it's going to be connected to guns and school shootings. It's going to be connected to mental health. It's going to be connected to internet security. It's going to be connected to data rights or human rights. But whatever comes about for this anti-bullying, Generation Z is going to demand a response. They are demanding a response, and I don't know exactly what it's going to be. It's probably going to be left up to them to come up with when they actually mature into their positions of power. But That's where we're at. And it's important to remember the long history. And so thank you, Kristen, for reminding us all, because most social workers do not know that child protection started with animal rights, because people were more concerned about protecting animals because animals were property and could do work and perform labor, and they were considered assets, right? And so there were laws to protect animals before there were laws to protect children. And it's also important to remember that bullying prevention, the way that we're doing bullying prevention in schools right now, all comes from one white guy from Norway in the 80s. Right. And thank you, Dr. Olius. Like, he did amazing things. And without him being the leader in that movement, we would not have addressed bullying at all throughout the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s. But boy, is it time to change that model by including more diverse perspectives. And so it's important for all social workers to know that history so that we can best move forward. Kristen or Marian, do you have any last words to say on your movements?
No, it was just really interesting to really research this specific topic, and thank you for listening.
I don't think I really have much more to say. I just think that as far as child prevention with child abuse and neglect, the movement needs to research, because I don't think it's in movement right now. Like I said, again, with the mainstream establishment, a lot of people don't realize how many children get abused and neglected every day. And so I'm actually a forensic interviewer, and so I get to interview children that have been abused and neglected and that have witnessed homicide or witnessed another act, against someone, or something's happened to them. And I think a lot of times people think that abuse is always just physical or sexual, but it's so much more to abuse than those two mainstream things that people realize. And I think it does take us as a society to get together to do that, because in Mary Ellen's case, if it wasn't for her neighbors that came together and started to go and say, you need to check on this child, she may have been being beat to death, or and so I would just encourage you guys to check out the Mary Ellen case. Is really interesting. She has a lot of things that she said on the stand, like during testimony and stuff like that. And it was a point where she didn't even know, she never had shoes before, and so it's just a lot. And just because it was way back then, the same thing that happened to her was actually happening before her with the Parkman boys, where they were being sent over. And so also just knowing that it's still happening today, and it just takes all of us as a society and the community to stick together and just try to protect our children.
Thank you very much. I think we're a little bit early, but I'm going to go ahead and end, because those are great words to end on. Thank you all very much for coming today and supporting my students to do this excellent work. And thank you to Glenda Alvin and the TSU Libraries for publishing our journal. And look for that. That will be announced. If you go to the webpage for that, you can follow the journal, but we'll have it up and everything will be posted, and you can read Kristen and Marian's papers here in about 2 weeks. By the end of the semester, that will be ready. But thank you all very much for joining us today.